Okay, here we go. We are on, territorial and economic expansion, the first part of period 5, 1844 to 1877. And this is a time where we see nationalism manifesting itself, no pun intended, here with the Manifest Destiny movement of the 1830s and the 1840s. So in the last unit, we talked about the hypernationalism that existed after the War of 1812 and how we saw economic nationalism, political nationalism. I'm not going to revisit all of that. But part of that is this belief in the idea that America has this sort of divine blessing to go ahead and overspread the continent. It's a mixture of you know, religious faith, okay, but it's also it's steeped in the idea of American exceptionalism. Here we are, America. We are fundamentally different from Europe. We have no aristocratic class. We have no nobility. We have no history of monarchy. We are fundamentally different and have a special place, and part of that is to overspread the entire continent. And there was also a lot of interest in taking Cuba and areas in Latin America. And John L. O'Sullivan in the Democratic Review was an advocate for this. And we talked about as America moves west, it's going to come into conflict with some of our neighbors, particularly Britain in Oregon and Mexico in the Southwest. And the first area where we see conflict over expansion is in Texas. And let's revisit this story. We don't have to go into as much detail as we did in class. We really dropped anchor and learned about the settlement of Texas. So remember, Texas used to belong to Spain when Spain owned Mexico until I think it was 1821. But we had renounced our claim to Texas in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, where we got Florida, and Spain renounced its claim to the Oregon Territory. But as Mexico became independent, I think it was 2 years later in 21, they realized very soon that they have this very rich, fertile northern province that's really an outpost. It's in the backwater of Mexico. Mexico City's a long ways away. And they want to attract yeoman farmer to develop the land and act as a buffer against hostile Indians, as well as prevent a return of American filibusters. Remember, we learned about the Green Flaggers. And I think it was 1813 that originally had the backing of the U.S. government. But then when they announced that they wanted to be independent, we pulled the plug and they were all executed. So Stephen Austin inherits land from his father, Moses Austin, who had worked with the Mexican government, and he becomes the father of Texas. Under the impresario system, a Texas settler could get a league of land for $30 credit. And again, like, well, what's that mean? Well, that amount of land would cost $5,000 cash in the United States. It was something that was not tenable. And Americans arrived in droves. And by 1830, just maybe 6 or 7 years into this system, it's 3-1 that Anglos outnumber Tejanos, and Americans are not abiding by the Mexican ban on slavery in 1829. Because remember, this is a federal system, which means dual sovereignty between the national government and the state government. And in this case, the Texans really wanted their state government to remain sovereign. So when they get combined with the state of Coahuila, and it becomes Coahuila, Texas, which had banned slavery, Texans really feel that the future of slavery is threatened. And we see a real change in the Mexican government, even though I know the law of April 6th of 1830, they banned Anglo immigration, and in very strong terms banned slavery. It's when Santa Anna switches in 1834 from being a federalist, right, which would have recognized state sovereignty, just like we have in the United States. Think about what's going on now and all of the different decisions, where Georgia has reopened, but Pennsylvania hasn't. That's a federal system, right? Well, Santa Anna repudiates the Constitution, tears it up of 1824, and now national authority is going to supersede all state authority. And so the Texans feel as if now they have no more independence, and they proclaim their independence literally in 1836, because it's in 1835 that the shooting starts, where we talked about Santa Anna invades Zacatecas, which is to the south of Texas. to put down a rebellion there. They had been resisting the centralist government, and there's no quarter, 2 days of pillage. And then we had the small skirmish at Gonzales. That was the come and take it flag. And then you had a minor skirmish in late 35 in Texas, where you have Santa Anna's not there, but the Mexican army driven out of San Antonio de Bejar by a Texas force. So now they hold up in the Alamo, and Santa Anna does a forced march throughout the winter of 35, and in February of 36 arrives at the Alamo early. And it's every person is killed inside. 187 are dead. But remember, the Alamo becomes a rallying cry because a few weeks later at San Jacinto, Santa Anna is captured and literally, under threat of death, has to cede Texas or give Texas its independence. But the Mexican Senate does not recognize that. And from Mexico's perspective, Texas is still a state. Well, immediately, Houston decides, that's the general that led the Texas Army and first president of Texas, that let's join the United States. But because that was tied with the expansion of slavery, it is kind of kicked down the road, and that's why Texas is the Lone Star State. It's an independent republic for 9 years. We also had issues with the British in Maine. It's a footnote to history called the Aroostook War, where there was disputes in lumber country between, what would that be? Is that New Brunswick? I apologize. My Canadian geography isn't what it used to be. Between Canada and the United States and Maine, they agreed in the Webster-Ashburn Treaty to split the difference. We didn't go to war there. And even though President Polk ran in 1844 on 5440, or fight referring to Oregon, since we had already started shooting with Mexico, Polk decided, let's not have two wars at a time. And rather than take the 54th line of latitude as a boundary, which would have gone all the way up to Russian Alaska, Polk conceded to take the 49th parallel, basically taking half. And of course, if you're a Northerner and you're anti-expansion of slavery, you see this as part of the slave power conspiracy, because we ceded any claim to British Columbia, which would have been another free state. So now things get really sticky when we annex Texas. And John Tyler, who was a Southern Whig, really was a Southern Democrat, who was William Henry Harrison's vice president. We all know the story. Harrison talks, tough guy, no hat, no overcoat in the rain for the longest inaugural address ever, and dies shortly thereafter. And Tyler really wanted to get Texas, but when word leaked out in 1844 of John C. Calhoun's letter to the British ambassador that this was to expand slavery in no uncertain terms, the Senate got hostile to it, and it didn't pass ratification. But then once Polk won the election on a very expansionist foreign policy of take 5440 or fight for Oregon, annex Texas, and find a way to get New Mexico and California, Tyler submits the annexation of Texas in early 1845. Remember, he's a lame duck president at that point. And it passes not through a treaty by the Senate, which requires 2/3, but rather by a joint resolution that only requires a simple majority. So we annex Texas, and it's really sticky too, because remember, there are two disputed boundaries within that. First of all, Mexico never recognized that Texas was independent, so they don't recognize our annexation, which is why they did break off diplomatic relations. And they insist that historically Texas's boundary had always been on the southern part, the Nueces River, not the Rio Grande. We, of course, insist that it's the Rio Grande. And even while the Slidell mission is taking place, John Slidell was a Louisiana lawyer sent down by President Polk to say, Texas is a done deal. We're not going to talk about it. Of course, the Mexicans balked at that because they thought that was the only reason that this special minister was down there. And instead, Slidell tries to make a deal. Here's some cash, and we'll take California and New Mexico. Well, even while that was going on, President Polk sent the U.S. Army into the disputed territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande River. They run into a Mexican patrol that had crossed the Rio Grande River, and there is shooting. 11 Americans are dead. President Polk says American blood has been spilled on American soil, and there is a vote for war. Very few conscious Whigs oppose it, one of them being Abraham Lincoln. And like the war is on a small scale, right? Like Stephen Kearny and John C. Fremont go into New Mexico, go into California. They're so sparsely populated. They seize those. California becomes an independent state, the so-called Bear Flag Republic. Zachary Taylor invades Mexico and wins a big battle. The name escapes me right now. That's embarrassing. Why can't I find it? Buena Vista. There we go. Forgot about that one. Sorry, needed my own edification there. And then Winfield Scott takes Mexico City, because all the while the American military is winning victory after victory, the Mexican government refuses to surrender until finally, after Scott takes Mexico City, they agree to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gives us the Mexican cession, which is basically the northern half of Mexico. And while this is going on, there's a little bit of a split where you have Southern Democrats that want more. They want all of Mexico. And you have some Northern conscious Whigs that see this as part to expand slavery. And also during this, we'll save, okay. Also during this, we saw the Wilmot Proviso, which intensifies the debate about slavery. I'll revisit that again in our next session, because I actually did them out of order. I did the second one first by mistake. And remember, David Wilmot is a Pennsylvania congressman who attaches a proviso to an Army appropriations bill that says slavery will be banned in any territory that we gain from this war. It passes the House not once, but twice. And of course, where is it defeated? In the Senate, because the South has a de facto veto with a 15-15 split. We're really going to talk about this in the next review, as this again intensifies feelings on both sides. Northerners see the power of the slave power conspiracy, the disproportionate political influence that the South continues to exert, and the South sees this as, all right, forget about anything that those people say. They want to stop the expansion of slavery in the North, which is tantamount to its elimination, because if slavery could not grow, it would become such a minority that eventually they would be powerless, the slave states, to protect slavery from the federal government. All right, so after the war, we settle agreements in Oregon with Britain, Clayton Bulwer. Yeah, it's minor divisions between Canada and the United States. The Gadsden Purchase is where we buy that southern part of Arizona to build a railroad. Also, when we talk about explaining Southern interests, so Pierce was a Northern doughface, right, as he is beholden to the Southern interest of his party. And he twice tries to get Cuba from Spain, as Cuba already had a slave plantation-based economy. And when Spain refused to sell, Pierce sent another 3 ministers to Ostend, Belgium, to meet with them. And their document, their manifesto, which basically said, it's kind of natural that Cuba is part of the United States and not yours, so why don't you sell it to us before we take it by other means? Kind of like the ultimatum that was given in the Slidell mission to Mexico. And as soon as word got out, all public support kind of got pulled back, as it was seen as kind of tangible evidence that the administration was really trying to push the slavery agenda. You learned about this in World Cultures. We talked about it with imperialism, that Matthew Perry secured trading rights with Japan. That's really at the crux of it. And there's just a couple of other things that fit better. The way that the review came up was, it was just reminding, like, a big part of Manifest Destiny also is the market revolution, right? You can go west when you have railroads. 1820s and 1830s is the canal boom. 1840s, 1850s, 1860s is the railroad boom. You can communicate long distances because of the telegraph and Samuel Morse. Also talking about, the industrial technology that is associated with the textile industry, and particularly the sewing machine. The market revolutions continued to have its downside where, look, the Panic of 1857 is super complicated to explain. It deals a lot with international banking and the huge export of grain following the end of the Crimean War, which the Stanford woman can teach you all about next year. And suffice to say, we have a northern financial collapse, a depression in farm prices, and just like we saw in 1837, the economy kind of grounds to a halt. The only thing not affected are cotton prices, and the southern economy sees themselves as being superior to that of the Yankee North because they are largely untouched by that. Also, just during this time, we're going to go back and revisit this when we do the West later. The Great American Desert just refers to the Great Plains, which are skipped, right? People got Oregon fever in the 1830s and went out to Oregon or into California. The original Americans that went west were just a few mountain men that were involved primarily in the fur trade. But we started to see gold and silver rushes during this time, most notably the California gold rush of 1849, and you start to see a pressure for the federal government to have squatters' rights. We'll revisit that when we talk about the Homestead Act. It becomes a big part of the Republican agenda. There are a lot of federal land grants that are given to railroads as well. So I think that those are our big ideas conceptually for this time. That wasn't too bad. The next one is pretty long, so lock in for that one. All right.